Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the McCrud webinar, Shaping the Alcohol Policy Environment, Past, Present, and Future, Part 2. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Louise, and I'm helping Mike to make sure that this webinar runs smoothly. We're joined again by Cassie Grayson from the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association. And Cassie will present the information in just a bit, which I'm really excited about. But first, I just want to share some brief housekeeping tips. So first, you will see a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and that orange arrow will expand and collapse this panel. The audio is also set to play from your computer speakers by default, but if you are having any problems or would prefer to call in, just click the phone call button under the audio tab and follow the directions. Also, you are automatically muted for this presentation. However, we welcome your engagement and questions. If you have questions during the presentation, you can enter them in the question box in the control panel. And then after the webinar, we will also use the hand raise button, which is it's circled in red right now. And that will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask those questions aloud. If you have any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat box. And with that, I will let Cassie take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I appreciate the introduction and the housekeeping. As Louise indicated, my name is Cassie Grayson. I'm the Director of Public Policy for the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association, or NABCA, or NABCA. Some are familiar with the organization. We're a national trade association representing alcohol regulators, with our primary membership being those jurisdictions that sell the product, like Michigan, a controlled jurisdiction. Well, this is part 2 of the webinar series, Shaping the Alcohol Policy Environment, Past, Present, and Future. So welcome back. I am gonna, I think I have control over the screen, so there we go. So the first thing I wanna do is just take a quick poll to see how many of you were able to participate in part 1 of the webinar series. Louise, thank you for pulling up the poll. You can see it here on your screen. Were you able to participate in part 1 of this webinar series? So yes or no, just trying to get a gauge of how many folks were able to join us that first time on April 30th. And Louise, it's in your queue if you want to publish it when it seems ready.
Yes, so we have 75% voted, so I will share that on out. 82% said yes, and 18% said no.
All right, that's great. So certainly you did not have to participate in the first one in order to participate in this version or this part 2, but obviously we covered some materials that will be helpful, but it's not critical to understanding what this webinar will be about. But if you are returning, thank you and welcome back. Whoopsie, I went too far. There we go. So in part 1, we covered the historical context of alcohol in the U.S. and provided details leading up to Prohibition and what transpired when states were given the primary authority to oversee alcohol regulation post the Prohibition era. We also got a high-level overview of the current trends on alcohol consumption and harm. And then we will now turn our focus in part 2 on effective alcohol regulation and enforcement and discuss factors driving trends in the alcohol marketplace. I think, Louise, I am not handling the forward portion very well, but we'll give it a whirl. So let's turn first to the science. At NABCA, we believe alcohol regulation should be driven by the science. And so what does the scientific evidence tell us about alcohol regulation and best practice? The CDC has weighed in on this topic through its Community Preventive Services Task Force. Once a topic area is identified for review, CDC pulls together a panel of prevention and public health experts who review the science on the topic by conducting a systematic review of the literature. The experts look at the rigor of the studies, the barriers of implementation, gaps in the science, and review and evaluate the economic impacts of the intervention. And based on the strength of the evidence and effectiveness in outcomes, they make recommendations. The Community Preventive Services Task Force is equivalent to the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, a panel of health experts who make recommendations for your individual level health, like how frequently should you get a colonoscopy or a mammogram. So the Community Preventive Services Task Force is that same type of recommending body, but for the community health aspect. From 2006 to 2012, the Community Preventive Services Task Force made the following recommendations on preventing excessive alcohol consumption. And as I noted, they look at a whole bunch of topic areas. So this is the period of time they turned and looked at alcohol consumption. The task force identified interventions related to limiting density of alcohol outlets, hours and days of sale. They also identified enforcement of the underage drinking laws through alcohol compliance checks as a best practice. They made recommendations related to pricing controls such as alcohol taxes, and they recommended against further privatization of government control over the sale of alcohol, meaning states that are control jurisdictions like Michigan, where the state is a market participant in the sale of the product, that they should remain in place. The only state to fully privatize in recent times is Washington State, which did so in 2011. Another body of research I want to draw your attention to is research funded by the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, led by Dr. Tim Namey out of Boston University. Through his research, and his team looked at and they compared the relative efficacy of state-level alcohol policies and assessed the strength of those policy environments. And the areas in which they looked at those policies, they pulled together a Delphi panel of experts. They identified 29 alcohol control policies known to be effective to change behavior, and then assessed states' policies and enforcement of those policies. They looked at enforcement countermeasures on underage and overservice and impaired driving. They looked at regulatory oversight, so whether you were a controlled jurisdiction or not, requiring training of licensees, and they also reviewed administrative inspections and sanctions and the regularity of those. They assessed limits on place, product, and price aimed at restricting heavy consumption, such as bans on outdoor signage and retail signage restrictions. And they took these policies, assessed them, and then gave each state an alcohol policy score. So the higher your score, the more safeguards a state had in place. So when they looked at these scores and compared them to state outcomes, such as binge drinking rates, youth, adults, both for youth and adults, impaired driving rates, homicide victimization, and cirrhosis mortality, what they found was a direct correlation between a state's APS score, their alcohol policy score, and these alcohol-related outcomes. So states with higher APS scores were found to have fewer harms. They've recently, just this year, these same researchers looked back nearly 20 years to see how a state's APS changed over time. And here you can see the change over time. Yellow is indicative that a state had less change in their APS in the near 20 years this assessment was done. And the deeper orange color reflects a more significant change. Too far. Thank you. Most states changed their APS score for the better, meaning they adopted more alcohol policy safeguards. However, when you look at the policies by subcategories, policies related to impaired driving measures or preventing excessive drinking, or those focused on youth and adults separately, you find that the majority of these increases are attributable to stronger impaired driving laws, with policies related to preventing excessive drinking, a primary risk factor for impaired driving, were left largely unchanged in most states. If we look to your neighboring states to see how Michigan's APS compares, we can see that the APS increased, and it's increased was similar to that of Ohio. However, neither Michigan nor Ohio changed their policy scores as significantly as Indiana and Wisconsin did. So they saw a more significant increase in their APS scores in the last 20 years as the study assessed. So as promised, we will now shift to discuss what is driving changes in the marketplace and the policy trends that have followed. So today we are seeing significant increases in licensed retailers, including non-traditional settings such as hair and nail salons, movie theaters, but we're also seeing a shift where craft producers are operating as retailers, so they're both producer and retailers. The craft movement is also driving a large influx of new products entering the market. As small local producers operate as retailers and direct shipment of alcohol expands, removing the middle tier of the alcohol distribution system known as the wholesalers, concerns over tainted alcohol products enter the market really does increase. So further, as home deliveries of alcohol have increased, concerns of use, access, and enforcement is challenged to keep pace with the growing and changing alcohol market in these non-traditional settings. So we're back to another poll, so please participate. It's very, very helpful to give us some context. So which of these trends that I just discussed give you the greatest pause? And I believe you can just select one. So is it increased number of alcohol retail outlets? Is it tainted products entering the market? Are you worried about increased advertising online? Perhaps you're concerned about new products entering the marketplace, or that home delivery is expanding. Just give us a sense of what the top thing here that most concerns you when you hear about it.
I'll give it a few more seconds for people. Okay, so we have 29% increased the number of alcohol retail outlets, 20% tainted products entering the market, 5% increasing advertising online, 7% new products entering the marketplace, and 39% home delivery of alcohol.
All right, thank you, Louise. I appreciate that. So, and next slide, please. So when we see these, the changes to the alcohol marketplace, they're really coming from all branches of government, and we need to recognize that. Certainly during COVID, we have seen many changes come from the executive branch through governor's executive orders. However, more frequently, we do see changes taking place in the legislative branch. So I want to turn our attention to the legislative branch and some of the pathways of change. Next slide, please. So some of these legislative pathways we've seen change current alcohol regulations include, but certainly are not limited to, but task force initiatives where they are large-scale reviews, sometimes through omnibus legislative proposals that change, sweeping changes to the alcohol policy landscape, and largely these are shifting toward removing restrictions, toward and really changing based on consumer demands. And new and changing business models have responded to consumer demands as well for convenience, including home delivery and e-commerce, which has begun to erode the traditional three-tier system, as I've mentioned. So I want to take us, this is a high-level view of what we're seeing across the country related to alcohol bills being introduced. And again, this is an important distinction. These are bills introduced, not enacted, but bills introduced. So when we look at these past 9 years to see what categories of laws have been introduced specific to alcohol, we find the bulk of these laws are specific to alcohol licensing, taxes, and changes to the Alcohol Beverage Control Agency, followed by impaired driving laws and direct shipping laws. So again, these are bills introduced, not enacted, but still notable to kind of get a sense of the activity that we're seeing around legislative bills being introduced across the country. Next slide, thank you. These next two slides take a deeper dive into Michigan and its border states. So while Indiana is on par with Michigan for a number of alcohol legislative bills introduced, Ohio and Wisconsin are drastically different pictures, really, when you see. In Michigan and Indiana, you're seeing upwards of 40 legislative bills over the last 9 years introduced specific to alcohol, whereas in Ohio and Wisconsin, it's a fraction of those bills. Again, introduced legislation. So next slide. As we look at enacted legislation, this region in relation to alcohol bills has been, I would say, you see that a number of these bills don't make it across the finish line. So it's still notable, though, in Michigan, comparatively in the region, that more bills are being enacted in Michigan than in its neighboring states. Next slide. But when you look at across the country, just the last 2 years, and where does Michigan stack up? And Michigan's enactment rate of alcohol legislation is just is not only seeing more activity in its legislature in relation to alcohol bills regionally, but it ranks among the states with the most alcohol legislation enacted in the country. Next slide. And we're going to turn it back to a poll. And given the level in which alcohol legislation is being introduced and enacted in Michigan, I would like to take a minute to see how you have engaged in alcohol policy discussions in your state. It's really critical to engage in these conversations, and so it's helpful to get a sense who's participating on this webinar if you've had the opportunity to engage. So, for example, you can select any and all that apply, but have you provided testimony on a state or local bill? Have you served on a task force or a work group related to alcohol policy? Have you attended a Michigan Liquor Control Commission meeting and or hearing? Have you wrote an editorial or letter to the editor on a policy topic? Or maybe you haven't had a chance to engage in alcohol policy, and that's perfectly fine as well, and you could note that. So we'll give it a minute, and then Louise, you'll publish the results.
Yes, and I'm hearing from some people, sometimes when you speak, they're not able to click. So I'll give it a couple extra seconds with no sound, and then I'll close it.
Okay.
Okay, so I see 2% provided testimony on a state or local bill, 26% served on a task force or working group related to alcohol policy, 40% attended a Michigan Liquor Control Commission meeting and or hearing, 7% wrote an editorial or letter to the editor on a policy topic, and 55% have not personally engaged in alcohol policy efforts.
Thank you, Louise. Well, the good news is there is a lot of activity, you can tell, in Michigan and in this space for you to weigh in and engage and to share your knowledge and expertise or your personal experience. So for that 55%, I would say get on out there and engage, and I'm sure Mike Tobias would help you find a way and a place to raise your voice. So I'd like to now turn our focus to the direct-to-consumer market. I think a fairly small percentage of you had identified home delivery as a concern, but I do want to share and take a little bit of time to unpack that area of policy because we are seeing big changes, and certainly we've seen some big temporary changes in the midst of the pandemic. Next slide. But I have to go back to the basics first and foremost, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about this three-tier system, but it is really important to the structure of in the U.S. context of how we get a product to market. So the traditional alcohol distribution system in the U.S. is this closed, independent, three-tier system of producers, wholesalers, and retailers. And the wholesale tier, I'm going to spend just a minute to tell you, and if you were on the first webinar, this might be redundant, but worth noting, in that wholesale tier, if you think about this structure as an hourglass, at the top you have the producers, you funnel down to the wholesale tier where you have a lot of checks and balances, one of which is tracking and the ability to track tainted products from entering the market and retrieve them from the market if they're found to be out in the marketplace. And it's also a place where we do excise tax collection, which in this country we have near 100% tax collection. So it's really important that middle tier that happens. And then after the wholesalers distribute it to the retailers, and that's then how it gets to the consumer. Next slide. So looking at direct shipping, you're going to see that the structure shifts slightly. And if you can click one more time, Louise, that would be helpful. You will see that the structure shifts slightly in that it removes the wholesale and the retail. Oops, there you go, you got it. It removes the wholesale and the retail tier. So the producer uses common carriers, FedEx and UPS at this point in time, to get the product to the consumer directly to their home. And now the risks within this environment is, of course, that youth access to alcohol, where common carrier delivery drivers are not trained to conduct proper carding and may inadvertently deliver alcohol to a minor or to a jurisdiction in a state that has dry counties where alcohol is not permitted to be sold. Recent undercover operations in Mississippi found both of those risks to be happening in their jurisdiction when they did some undercover operations to track this. But we also lose an important check and balance, as I noted before, in the ability to collect those taxes and to ensure we have those taxes collected, as well as the tainted product element. And I'll just make a side note on tainted products. We may feel like, gee, that's not an issue in our country, and you're truly right. We don't have a significant issue, but it is because of this closed, tight structure that has given us that safety net. All right, now we're ready to go to the next one. So if you look at this policy landscape of direct shipment at a high level, most of the country, including Michigan and its surrounding states, permit direct shipping of some form of beverage alcohol. But if you go to the next slide, you can see that when you break this down by beverage category, it's a different picture. So regionally, it's standardly that wine is only permitted. However, in Ohio, they also permit beer. Few states permit all forms of beverage alcohol. Some states simply exclude the practice outright. You can see that according to the legend. Keep in mind, though, this data is from the 2018 Stop Act report to Congress, which is 2017 data. And as I've noted, this landscape is changing rapidly. And so if you are in Michigan, and perhaps I have it inaccurate on this, this is data from 2017, so I just want to make sure that there's that notation. Next slide. So another way that alcohol gets direct to the consumer is home deliveries. And this is typically facilitated by keeping the wholesale and the retail tiers intact, but using third-party delivery drivers to take the product directly to the consumer's home. And these third-party vendors include companies such as Uber Eats, Instacart, Amazon Prime, but certainly, you know, there are many. This is just an example. Next slide. But beyond the third-party delivery apps, there are online sales platforms. The most widely known company is Drizzly, which you see reflected on the slide here. But they really operate in this middle space where they facilitate the sale on behalf of the retailer, but they never take control of the product. So once the sale is made, an employee of the retailer facilitates the delivery to the consumer. And if you go to the next slide, we're back at the Stop Act report to Congress in 2018. They also look at this at a high level, what is happening across the country with home delivery. And it's a bit of a different picture than direct shipping. You can see here that fewer states permit home delivery through third-party vendors, according to 2017 data. Again, fast-moving area of policy, so this could look different today than this is reflecting, but it gives you a general idea. Next slide. Just as we did with direct shipping, we want to look down to the beverage type because that is how we regulate alcohol in this country. We have more restrictions around liquor, a few less on wine, and then our least restriction is typically on beer, just as a general rule of thumb. So when you look at this, it's interesting that you can see here that those states that do permit home delivery, the majority of them permit all beverage categories, beer, wine, and spirits to be delivered direct to the consumer. Next slide. So, you know, this new marketplace with home deliveries of alcohol have their challenges, some of which I've already mentioned a couple of times, but It's the ensuring the proper excise tax and sales collections for a number of states. They have found when they've done audits that they're not getting the sales tax collection either. While states that permit direct shipping practices may require a license, alcohol law enforcement must monitor this market to ensure unlicensed shippers aren't entering the market on top of their typical daily function. So that is a bit of a challenge. The question really remains, as states remove the wholesale tier in the distribution through direct shipment or carve outs for craft producers to be retailers, how will we track down the tainted alcohol and remove it from the market safely? And then there's the question of sales to minors. Of course, that's the concern for so many, and age verification. Recent underage compliance checks of home deliveries by way of third-party apps in North Carolina found that at least half of the attempts to purchase alcohol by a minor were successful. And in one case, the driver scanned her own ID to circumvent the app process that was clearly built as a stopgap to prevent sales to minors. Which brings me back to the question about enforcement. Not only is training needed for enforcement to do underage decoy operations to prevent illegal sales to minors in this new market, but training is needed for delivery drivers, for both third-party vendors and common carriers to ensure that they are using carding practices to prevent youth access to alcohol. Next slide. When I have the opportunity to talk to prevention and public health, I take the time to talk about the need to establish this rational nexus between the outcomes you are often tracking to the regulation. So if we don't do a good job making the case for why a regulation is on the books through good data surveillance, then it really could be in jeopardy. These regulations could be in jeopardy when in the courts they're appealed. Next slide, thank you. I want to just leave you with some thoughts to ponder. One is when you're doing awareness and engagement, as you do those activities, I want to encourage you to monitor that policy landscape, just as I laid out here today, what's happening on direct to consumer, what's happening on home delivery. These are data that are publicly available to you as well. And that you engage in these public policy discussions in your state. I mean, clearly there's a lot of activity happening in Michigan on alcohol policy, and you have a rightful place in that conversation as somebody who does public health and prevention. And, not to make an assumption that they know this information, because often that is not the case. In fact, I had a colleague in Pennsylvania who went into a legislator to talk about a particular proposal he was concerned with, and he walked out feeling pretty surprised that that particular legislator didn't know the facts that he thought most people did. And the reality is, when you live and breathe this stuff every day, like you and I do, that is just common knowledge, perhaps to us, but certainly not to legislators who are dealing with a myriad of issues. And it may not be an issue that they sit on a committee that hear a lot about it. So it's really incumbent upon public health and prevention to educate policymakers, decision makers. Michigan Liquor Control Commission is included in that, but certainly your state and local legislators as well, so that they know the data, they know the science, they can be educated and then make informed decisions to make sure there's a balance in these conversations. So part of making that case, if you just go back one more time, thank you, is identifying and collecting data to support prevention. And of course, as I mentioned on the first webinar, you are so fortunate. You're one of 5 states that has an alcohol epidemiologist. And this is a person who can point you in the right direction to get you to those data. And then, of course, engage other stakeholders. You never know who. I have worked on many occasions with neighborhood associations, in some cases, wholesalers. It just depends on the topic area, but looking for those unlikely bedfellows can really help you expand your coalition and your reach, and perhaps help you make a strong case. Next slide. The second thought I want to leave you with is just this need to support enforcement. I laid out a case that there's some real challenges here for law enforcement as the marketplace changes and expands. And it's really stretching enforcement capabilities in many ways. And, I just like to raise that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration back in 2005 did a study and wrote a report. And it noted that alcohol enforcement resources were dwindling then, 15 years ago. And they are really shrinking as we speak today. Few people are having conversations about the impact these changes are having on enforcement, and yet they're instrumental to shaping and monitoring this environment to protect public health. And so as we think about supporting law enforcement partners and encouraging innovative strategies, as I mentioned, in North Carolina, they were doing underage decoy operations for home deliveries. That's non-traditional settings, typically that we think about in terms of compliance checks. What about tracking unlicensed shippers? I know Vermont is doing work in that area, Virginia is actually doing work in that area. And it takes a tremendous amount of time, but there's some interesting work that can be done there. And then lastly, technology to inform strategies for enforcement. They are certainly encouraged to use big data to inform their resource allocation. And I've been fascinated by something Vermont has been doing with a resource allocation tool that is using big data to help them know where they could predict potential challenges happening, and those are the areas in the state they can strategically go to educate licensees and make sure that they're in compliance with the laws. Next slide. So I've mentioned a number of resources in the time we've had today, specific to where you can get data, but I mentioned the Stop Act report to Congress. If maybe some of you on this call, perhaps you help populate that report, but every state has a report every year, and you have a PowerPoint slide that can help give you talking points that unpack that what is a pretty dense report, but those are available to the public. Additional data that you can find is through the Alcohol Policy Information System, APIS, which is an NIAAA funded project where you can see underage drinking related policies over time, how they've changed, how you compare to other states. And then, as is the case when you're working in policy, sometimes you need legal expertise to help unpack a complicated legal a legal bill, for example, or understand what the impact could be. And I would direct you to Change Lab Solutions, where they are providing technical assistance to public health and prevention groups to that point. Next slide. And I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I think it is worth repeating that you have an alcohol epidemiologist in your state, one of 5 in the country. And Patrick Hindman, who's hopefully on the webinar, certainly we can pass the mic to you eventually where you can say a few words, but this is a valuable resource you have in your state, and it's a very nuanced area to understand how to unpack these data and the data that's available. So he is a valuable resource you have in your state that if you have not tapped into, you should be. And the alcohol-related disease impact, which is called ARDI. It's a CDC resource that is really great because it gives you state estimates and national and state estimates on alcohol-related health impacts. So I'd be remiss if I did not talk about COVID a little bit, and I'll be brief, but I do want to share, I think I mentioned this very, very briefly on the webinar back on April 30th, but we are continuing to develop these resources. Operational changes for alcohol retailers are changing rapidly in this current pandemic, and we are tracking those changes state by state with interactive dashboards. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the first dashboard we have is at a high level. This is tracking week by week when executive orders are expiring or extending. It also tracks what alcohol retail channels, so grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations, et cetera, what retail channels have been deemed essential in your state, and you can compare by hovering over each state. And if you go to the next slide, you can see these next 2 slides will actually talk about on-premise operations, so restaurants and bars. And on these dashboards, you're going to see requirements for social distancing, whether there's curbside delivery is permitted, whether the purchase of alcohol has to be made with food, whether mixed drinks to go is permitted and under what conditions, does it have to be in a refillable container. So there's a lot of details that also even tell you if these rules and regs vary by locality. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see off-premise outlets. And for the off-premise operational changes, it's been interesting to try to capture and compare these variables because the executive orders have come out talking about the retail channels, how it'll impact restaurants, how it'll impact bars or liquor stores. But we regulate, as you've seen through this webinar, by beverage category, beer, wine, liquor, and we permit different products to be sold in different venues. So we've broken these down. You can see tabs for beer, wine, and liquor. And so these are the changes that we're seeing across off-premise outlets. Here you can see I've highlighted liquor. Traditionally in this country, we have had tighter restrictions around liquor. So that has continued to keep pace during the pandemic. So I want to take an opportunity. Of course, we're going to pass it over to questions, and we'll have a good length of time for questions. And I know that I want to just briefly mention, I know Mike Tobias had mentioned that he's working on a letter, a sign-on letter for folks who may be wanting to weigh in on COVID and alcohol. So Mike, maybe I pass it over to you to share some of those efforts that you have underway.
Yeah, thanks, Cassie, and thanks for presenting today. I do want to mention that, so yes, we are working with some folks to send a letter to the governor, the legislature, and the people of Michigan. And kind of the broad message is that we feel that alcohol is very available in the state of Michigan right now, and that it doesn't necessarily need to be made more available. I think some of we feel badly about the bars and restaurants that are suffering, but there's efforts to, as an example, allow cocktails to go or spirits to go from bars and restaurants. So everybody look for that letter to go out very soon. Also just want to comment on a few other things and hope you will take some questions like you said, Cassie. But as far as direct-to-consumer shipping issues, it may have been mentioned last time too, but we did have a recent victory in Michigan. A retailer in Indiana wanted to ship directly to consumers in Michigan, and the Court of Appeals upheld that they cannot do that. We might have some folks, I believe we have some folks from the Liquor Control Commission who may, perhaps comment further if there's anything more to that. But that has gone on recently. We are fortunate to have an alcohol epidemiologist, as mentioned, Pat. And we also have other experts too that McCrud is building a stronger relationship with. I'm talking about some researchers from Michigan State University, Dr. Deborah Holden, who's a little bit hard to reach sometimes, but her colleagues Rick Sadler and Maika Smart, they've been very gracious and done presentations for the Michigan Coalition to Reduce Underage Drinking. And we're talking with Rick about some of the outlet density things that we're working at now. Change Lab, you mentioned them also. They've been very grateful to Michigan. We received ongoing technical assistance last year about local control issues and those kinds of things. And then you also mentioned, I think last time, toward liquor control and alcohol, no ordinary commodity. But alcohol, no ordinary commodity, you can certainly get on Amazon. I may have some additional copies of Toward Liquor Control if anybody is interested, or we may be able to get some. But thanks again. I hope there's some questions. Are we going to let people raise?
And Mike, I would just say NABCA has Toward Liquor Control books. If anybody is interested in those, we certainly can help get those if you don't have enough copies.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I guess we're going to open it up for questions, or do we want to pass it over to Patrick, maybe as the alcohol epidemiologist, to say a few things?
Sure. Pat, are you on?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the shout out, guys. So like Cassie said, I'm one of 5 in the country supported by the CDC. So I'm here working 100% on alcohol related issues, including tracking chronic disease and acute issues like motor vehicle crashes, as well as helping local coalitions like McCrud and the Michigan Alcohol Policy Group that Mike is a part of. So, I'm here, all things alcohol related, to help in any way that I can. Kathy mentioned that we work with data quite often, which as an epidemiologist, data is basically our go-to. So if you need help with data, interpreting data, finding data, getting data, anything data related, I can certainly help. Even if I don't have it, I have really great contacts that might, or we can certainly track something down if you are looking for something really specific. So, yep, I'm here to help. My contact info isn't here, of course, which is fine, but I'm sure Mike can send it out, and I think we can probably put it in the chat box or whatever if you guys want my email or something. But feel free to reach out if you have any questions or ideas or anything like that. I'm happy to work with anybody who wants to tackle some alcohol-related projects.
Hey, Pat, one thing, you're working on a fact sheet with alcohol and COVID too, correct? Do you want to say anything about that?
Yep, so I have completed it. It's with communications right now, just waiting to be approved. So I'm playing the waiting game at this point, and we'll publish that on our website as well as email it to you, Mike, and any other folks' emails that I have. I'll distribute it as widely as I can, and then anybody else can send it on as well. So I'm hoping to get that back from communications any day now. With COVID going on right now, it kind of is part of the point to get it out as fast as possible, ideally before it's over. So yeah, I'm hoping to get it out soon.
Patrick, can you give us a little preview of some of the content that might be included in terms of alcohol and COVID? I mean, from a CDC perspective, it could just some high level comments.
Yeah, so essentially, alcohol and COVID, I guess you would say don't mix. Alcohol weakens the immune system. So, if you're drinking alcohol often during a time like this, your immune system is more susceptible to things like a virus or COVID-19. So, it's important to either not drink at all or drink less if you can during a time like this. Alcohol certainly won't cure any type of virus or kill any virus like COVID. I think there was some speculation that alcohol might be protecting people and or killing COVID, which is absolutely not true. So things like that, essentially, alcohol is not going to help in any way, shape, or form.
Thanks, Pat. I've got a question here, Cassie. I think it was mentioned about I believe you mentioned Washington State was privatized. Did you say 2011?
I did. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can't believe it's been that long, but okay, so maybe somebody's curious to learn more about that. And I'm curious to know, like, I'm assuming that people are studying that, the effects, but can you just tell a little bit more about what's going on in Washington?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So now enough time has passed that it has been, it's a natural experiment that researchers certainly have jumped on to study. So there are a number of peer-reviewed journal articles that NABCA has worked to summarize because it's just the facts, it's just what they have found to be true. But it is a complicated picture to unpack because when that happened, they also cut their beer tax, they legalized marijuana. So there are a lot of things going on over this time period to try to, isolate how the impact of privatization impacted the public. However, that said, they have found that probably one of the biggest takeaways was the explosion of locations selling spirits. They went from around 300 or so locations selling spirits to upwards of 1,600 locations selling spirits. And so when you think about the literature on outlet density, it typically, and I'm summarizing here, says, more outlets can lead to more problems. But that's not necessarily what happened in Washington State. They had an expansion of places selling spirits. And there's not a ton of literature out there that talks about that specifically, although Patrick, if you have more and you want to pipe in, you are welcome to, because I'm not a researcher. However, they did find this explosion of places selling spirits, and they also surveyed voters because it was a vote of the people. Ultimately, they tried to do it legislatively. It was not successful, and it went back to a referendum item, and that's how it ultimately was passed. But they voted, they took the vote of the people, and they wanted to see, how do people feel about those people who voted for this? How do they feel now, seeing what they're seeing? And one of the takeaways from that study was that people had about 20% of those who voted for the provision have voter remorse. They don't like what they're seeing. They don't like seeing spirits, in some cases behind lock and key, in all over in the state. They don't like what they see. And that's one of the reasons they say they would have changed their vote. Well, 20% would have changed the outcome. If those 20% of people would have known what they know today, and they say they wouldn't have voted that way, that outcome would not have been of privatization. So I think that's an interesting element. Price went up significantly to overcome the state selling the product. That's a natural revenue stream. Michigan has this too, that goes into the state coffers, and the state had to figure out how it was going to fill that gap. One of the ways to fill that gap, of course, is to increase taxes. Now, of course, if you're talking public health, increased taxes has traditionally been seen as a best buy to reduce alcohol-related harm. And so that can offset harm, of course, if you have that increase. But the rationale for why it was done was to sort of cover that gap that the state had in its regular revenue stream coming in. So we have a whole slide deck analyzing those peer-reviewed journal articles, unpacking it to tell the story of what did happen there. And I'd be happy to pass those along to you, Mike, and you can share with everybody on the call or whoever asked that question.
Great, that'd be great if you could share that information, Cassie. Again, just a reminder, if you have questions, please raise your hands. We'd like to get some questions in there. Another question, I think one of your slides mentioned about you measured or the number of states that have enacted legislation. It looks like Michigan was kind of leading the way. How did you measure that? Is that just simply, but yeah, how is that measured?
Yeah, so these are, the way we identify an alcohol bill, we're using a service called Leonine Focus. They're a public policy service that tracks legislation for really any entity who's wanting to kind of see what's going on. And so we've identified sort of the categories of legislative bills we're interested in, and then we're able to see how many of those types of bills were introduced. So that's how that's captured and populated, to give you a sense of from our end. And I should have put that source, but Leonine Focus is the organization that we utilize to track legislation across the country. And so those categories you would have seen in that slide, those are their categories of how they identify. They have legal policy folks who are coding and categorizing these bills and then sharing them with people who pay for the service. So NABCA uses that service to kind of track at a high level what's happening across the country at any given moment on alcohol. And the fortunate piece is we have an ability to look over time as well.
All right, thanks. How about, are there any questions you're seeing, Louise? I've got a question or two, but I want to give people from the audience a chance to really ask the questions if they have it. But are you
and Mike, if there isn't a question off the top, I'm just curious if Commissioner Lasher is on. Certainly, I'd love to have her have an opportunity to speak to the crowd, not to put her on the spot, but if she's on, it would be great.
Yeah, and I think I can unmute her. The other thing, can you repeat that service name, Cassie?
It's Leonine. It's Leonine Focus.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I throw it out there too, if there's folks from OHSP that have anything they want to share. The Office of Highway Safety Plan traditionally does a really great traffic safety summit that kind of I'm always happy to go to when I can. So I just want to throw a blanket out there. If anybody from OHSP has anything they want to comment or share, please let us know.
And
yes, I'm sorry.
Perfect.
It is Geraldine Lasher. I am on the line. I apologize I couldn't get on as quickly, Cassie. But I just a very brief comment. Just thank you. This was a really helpful presentation. I really appreciate the information. It really I think these kind of discussions have really been helpful.
Excellent. I'm glad. I'm happy to help where I can.
And I don't
you
want,
know, I think, Mike, I was just going to mention briefly too, is that, you know, in the midst of COVID, the traditional data points, this came up on a recent interactive dialogue that the U.S. Alcohol Policy Alliance hosted, which I know, Mike, you're part of, and I participated, and probably others on the call did too. But one of the things that was raised in that dialogue was that, you know, the traditional data points that you would go to make a case for, you know, tracking alcohol-related harms, are likely going to reflect lower numbers. So impaired driving, for example, is likely going to be lower just because people are not out and about, locations aren't open. And so, you know, one might come to the conclusion that the opportunities that have been presented in the midst of pandemic to do home delivery, you know, where that was otherwise not permitted, you know, is not having harm on the public. But at the same time, we recognize we're not in normal times, and so how would that policy change impact during normal times? I mean, these are really important policy questions that policymakers are going to be having to weigh in on as these conversations persist. And Mike or others, have you thought about those data and other data sources you may look to for input?
I think that's a really good point. I see Barry also has a question, so I'm going to unmute him right now. Go ahead, Barry.
No, I didn't have a question. I got my answer. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
and just a comment, I don't want to put people on the spot, but did I hear you correctly say that in Washington, the number of retailers that sell spirits kind of blew up to 1,600 locations? And I don't have the numbers in front of me with the liquor control, with our data in front of us, but I feel like we have, well, we can double that here in Michigan or triple it, or I don't know how many locations we have in Michigan, but that's, again, kind of a broad concern about, you know, the number of retailers in Michigan, and more about these non-traditional sites like dog parks and more movie theaters, more fast food restaurants, those kinds of things, kind of getting into the marketplace of selling alcohol. But so again, if 16, I mean, I guess it does seem like a large increase if it was from 300 to 1,600, but again, I'll be interested to see what comes out of there. But
I have another question. Marisol, I'm unmuting you.
Yes, in regard to the tainted products that are coming out, have we developed a strategy relative to the mixing of alcohol and marijuana, or alcohol and THC?
Oh boy, I would not be the expert on that. So it's a great question. And if anybody else has knowledge in that area, I welcome their input.
We actually, the liquor control commissioners and some of our key staff just had another conversation with the Marijuana Regulatory Agency this week, and continuing the conversations that, you know, no, we are not looking to see any of those types of infused types of products in the state of Michigan. We're still having the conversation about ensuring that our liquor licensees don't also become dispensary locations. So that's still an ongoing conversation. It's not the intent of the Marijuana Regulatory Agency to have that happen either. So we've been working cooperatively, but yeah, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, we are looking to ensure that we do not have marijuana infused alcohol in the state of Michigan.
and just to add to that, I could be mistaken, but I believe Michigan did pass a law prohibiting that a few years ago. But about
You are correct. Yes.
Yep. And with the issue with the dispensaries becoming dispensary locations, alcohol licensees, it's been a few months ago, but Michigan Alcohol Policy Promoting Health and Safety, and I believe the Michigan Prevention Association, our two organizations did weigh in kind of against that. And so I was curious about any updates, but so far it sounds like nothing's transpired, so that's good to hear.
I have a question, Mike, and I don't know if you know or Commissioner Lasher, but does Michigan permit third-party delivery drivers or license common carriers and producers for direct shipping?
My gut is to say, I think that they do, but I don't know if there could be some Liquor Control Commission staff on as well, but maybe my gut feeling is they do, but maybe somebody else can kind of verify that.
I was worried about getting put on the spot for questions, so now I'm doing that to others. I apologize if nobody knows the answer. It's totally okay. I just thought I would lob the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much. I mean, we've been creative about how to get alcohol out to people in Michigan in general, so I would think we have that available. Are there any other questions in the queue? Louise, I've got kind of one final one maybe, or a comment or two, but can prefer to take some questions if they're out there.
Oh, I have two people. I will unmute William first.
Hello, William, or Bill Amundson, MyCap, Michigan Council on Alcohol Problems. Recently, there was an item in the Lansing State Journal, a very small item, but that quoted Pat Gigliardi, the chairperson of the Michigan Liquor Control Commission, reminding us that during this sequestering here in Michigan, there is a large increase in drinking. So I just would lay that out there. And the other thing that I would lay out, and I did not see it on your chart at all, is the extension of hours for sales. And in the last 10 years, there have been 5 bills introduced into the state legislature to extend the hours from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And of course, that's just a stepping stone to 24 hours, period. We've beat them back pretty well, but you just don't know because it all comes up to the last 2 weeks of the legislature, and then you see what goes in through the lame duck session. So far, we've been able to halt that, but we want to continue to halt that. Are there any comments from other people out there on that issue?
Well, I was just going to add a comment to what the science says on hours of expanded hours, which you would have seen on the front end of the presentation from the Community Preventive Service Task Force, which was to limit hours. And what the CDC found and what the Community Preventive Services Task Force panel experts found was anything more than 2 hours, increasing 2 hours, increases harm. And so that's just something to be aware of as these conversations happen.
Yes, and Pat, our epidemiologist, I'm sorry, Pat, I don't remember your last name. He brought that up as well. Yes. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I see Tom will be our last question. So there you go.
Hi, it's not really a question. I'm Tom Hagan, Michigan Liquor Control. I just wanted to provide some clarity that we do in Michigan have a third-party facilitator license, and we do have a direct shipper license, and we have a team that monitors direct shipping, common carriers, and third-party facilitators.
Hey, thanks for jumping in.
That's really helpful. Yeah, I want to say, I know in Virginia, they've told me that it takes them hours to kind of cross-reference those common carrier reports. And so I don't know if you have any experience with that, but I would imagine it would probably take any state quite a bit to track down and make sure that, unlicensed shippers aren't entering the market and so forth. I mean, are you experiencing that, or would you be knowledgeable to speak to that?
Yes, the team works constantly to try to monitor what's going on with carriers and third-party facilitators, and we're constantly getting complaints and looking into those situations. But you're right; it takes hours on end really to decipher what's really going on and look at records. We require that FedEx and UPS provide us information that we can review, but it takes hours to pour through that information.
Yeah, thanks for jumping on, Tom. Appreciate it.
Sure. Absolutely, Mike.
I do want to give a shout out in general just to Commissioner Lasher and the Liquor Control Commission, and also Highway Safety Planning and our other statewide partners. They've got really great staff that are dedicated and really help and complement what McCrud's trying to do in some of the areas. So, many thanks to all the Liquor Control Commission staff and commissioners, the OHSP staff. Just something to look for. We do looking at having a webinar on some of these direct-to-consumer shipping issues. I actually have a call later this afternoon, and we're setting up a 2-part series on that, so we can learn more about some of those court cases and direct-to-consumer shipping issues. But is there anything else, Cassie, you want to say?
Just thank you so much for the opportunity to do this and spend these last couple of days talking about alcohol policy in Michigan. I just really appreciated the opportunity. So, and thanks for what everyone has contributed and what you're doing, Mike. It's good work.
Yeah, one more thing I'll say thank you. And also, Cassie, I didn't mention this in her brief bio, but she is somewhat of an accomplished author. At least she has a chapter in a book. What is the name of that book again, Cassie? It's at the office. I don't have it with me, but what is the name of that book?
Talk about putting someone on the spot, Mike. I was asked to contribute a chapter to a book that the American Public Health Association published a couple of years ago. And it's something to the effect of addressing alcohol-related harm. So you know what, I'll get it for you and you can send it out. But I would not say I'm an accomplished author, but yes, I did contribute to a chapter. It's true. So yes, I can share that with you, the specific name, but it's something along those lines, addressing alcohol-related harm.
Right. Well, yeah, please send it along. And I'm a bit of a book nerd. And so Cassie and other authors of that book were able to sign my book at one of the alcohol policy conferences. And she was very nice in the comments she left in my book. But we'll get that title out and get it out to people. And maybe people want to do some reading in their spare time. But Louise, anything from you? We're about a minute over, but thank you, everybody. Louise, last call, anything?
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Cassie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.